He arrived in a tailored suit, clutching a briefcase that held the power to end 1,000 livelihoods, but he didn't know that a single cup of muddy water would be the thing that finally saved his soul. We often think that the person with the most money in the room is the one who holds all the cards, yet in the heart of the Philippines, wealth is measured not by what you have in the bank, but by how much room you have in your heart for a stranger. Arthur was a man who lived by the clock and the bottom line, a titan of industry from London who viewed the world as a series of transactions. He came to the islands not to admire the sunset, but to streamline a factory, to cut costs, and to silence the voices he deemed inefficient. He saw the bustling streets of Manila not as a vibrant tapestry of life, but as a chaotic obstacle to his progress. But the Philippines is a way of slowing down even the fastest runner. It has a way of stripping away the suit, until all that is left is a man underneath. Before this journey was over, Arthur would realize that he had been starving in his mansion, and the feast he truly needed was waiting for him in a humble bamboo hut. If you believe that the most powerful force in the universe isn't gold, but the quiet kindness of a stranger, subscribe to Island Revelations as we explore stories that change the heart. Arthur stood on the balcony of his penthouse suite, looking down at the shimmering heat rising from the pavement of Makati. To him, the hum of the city was a dissonant chord, a mess of unoptimized movement. He adjusted his watch, a piece of engineering that cost more than the average local would earn in a lifetime, and felt a surge of irritation. The humidity was a physical weight, an uninvited guest that clung to his expensive shirt. In his world, precision was God. He had built an empire by trimming the fat, by firing the slow, and by never letting emotion cloud a spreadsheet. He had come to this tropical archipelago with a singular, cold purpose, to shutter a redundant distribution center in a rural province and return to London by the weekend. He looked at the faces in the street below, vendors pushing carts, jeepney drivers laughing in the thick of gridlock, and felt a pang of disdain. How could a people so inefficient be so loud? How could there be so much laughter in a place that, by his calculations, was failing? He didn't see the community. He saw only the chaos. He didn't see the smiles. He saw only the lack of a proper corporate structure. To Arthur, the Philippines was a problem to be solved, not a place to be experienced. The journey to the province only deepened his resolve. As the sleek black car traded the glass tower for the dusty, winding roads of the countryside, Arthur tapped his foot impatiently. Every stop for a crossing carabao, every slow-moving tricycle laden with sacks of rice, felt like a personal affront to his schedule. He barked orders into his phone, his voice sharp and jagged against the soft, melodic chirping of the cicadas outside. He saw the small sari-sari stores with their hand-painted signs and the children playing in the dirt with nothing but a discarded tire and a stick. To Arthur, this wasn't culture, it was a lack of ambition. He viewed the concept of Filipino time not as a relaxed pace of life, but as a symptom of a world that didn't understand the value of a second. He was a man made of silicon and salt, hard and unyielding, convinced that he was a teacher and the islands were a student that refused to learn. As they reached the edge of the coastal town, the sky began to bruise with the purple and gray of an impending monsoon. The air turned electric, and the first heavy drops of rain began to crater the dust. Arthur's driver, a quiet man named Ernesto who had endured Arthur's biting remarks for 3 hours, suggested they pull over for safety. Arthur refused, his ego demanding they reach the factory before sunset. But the Philippines does not take orders from CEOs. Within minutes, the road turned into a river of chocolate-colored mud. The engine groaned, sputtered, and finally died as a car slid off the soft shoulder, tilting precariously into a ditch. Arthur sat in the sudden silence, the rain drumming a deafening rhythm on the roof. He was trapped in a metal box, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the rising water on the floorboards, and his phone showing no service. For the first time in 30 years, the man who owned everything realized he had absolutely nothing of use. He was alone in the dark, and his pride was the only thing keeping him cold. The storm did not merely pass over. It settled in, a rhythmic thrashing of palm leaves and a relentless roar on the car's roof. Arthur sat in the dim light, his phone a useless slab of glass in his hand. He watched through the blurred window as Ernesto, the driver he had treated like a mere extension of the steering wheel, stepped out into the deluge without a second thought. Arthur expected him to run for cover, to leave the arrogant foreigner to his fate. Instead, he saw Ernesto wading through knee-deep water toward a flickering light in the distance, a small, stilt-legged house standing defiantly against the wind. Minutes felt like hours as Arthur sat shivering, the cold dampness of the Philippine rain seeping into his bones. Then, a knock on the window. It wasn't Ernesto. It was a young boy, perhaps no older than 10, holding a large banana leaf over his head like a makeshift shield. Beside him stood an elderly woman, her face a map of deep lines and sun-kissed skin. Gesturing for Arthur to come out, Arthur stepped out into the mud, his $1,000 suit instantly ruined, feeling a strange vulnerability as a wind tore at his hair. He was led into the small hut where the air smelled of wood smoke and dried fish. There was no electricity, only the soft amber glow of a single kerosene lamp. The elderly woman, whom the boy called Lola, didn't ask for his name or his credentials. She simply took his wet jacket and handed him a faded, oversized T-shirt that smelled of sun-dried laundry. Ernesto was already there, helping the boy move heavy sacks of rice away from a leak in the roof. Arthur stood in the center of the room, a titan of industry reduced to a shivering guest. He expected a bill. He expected a negotiation. Instead, Lola handed him a bowl of lugor, a simple rice porridge topped with toasted garlic and ginger. It was the cheapest meal he had seen in the country, yet as the warmth traveled down his throat, it felt more valuable than any Michelin-starred dinner in London. As the night deepened, Arthur watched a phenomenon he had never seen in a boardroom: Bayanihan. Neighbor after neighbor arrived at the hut, battling the storm not to seek shelter for themselves, but to check on the old woman on the hill. They brought extra candles, a piece of plastic sheet to patch the roof, and shared stories that erupted into laughter despite the thunder shaking the walls. They treated Arthur not as a billionaire to be feared, but as a human to be cared for. One man, whose own home was likely leaking, spent an hour under Arthur's car in the pouring rain, working with Ernesto to wedge stones under the tires. When the man returned, covered in grime and shivering, Arthur reached for his wallet to pay him. The man gently pushed Arthur's hand away, smiling with a humbleness that felt like a rebuke. "No, sir," Ernesto translated softly. "He says it is Malasakit. We look after each other because that is what we do." Arthur sat back on a wooden bench, watching the community interact. He saw the way they shared the meager portions of food, ensuring the guests and the elderly were fed first. He saw the respeto in the way the children kissed the hands of their elders, a silent acknowledgement of a wisdom he realized he lacked. He had spent his life building walls and calling it security. These people lived in houses with thin walls and found their security in each other. His internal architecture began to crumble. He looked at his ruined watch. The glass was fogged, the hands frozen. For the first time, he didn't care about the time. He realized that efficiency was a lonely island, while their slowness was a bridge to one another. The redundant factory workers he had come to fire weren't just lines on a spreadsheet. They were the brothers, sons, and fathers of people like Lola. They were a heartbeat, and he had come to stop it. When the sun rose the following morning, the world looked different. The storm had washed away the dust, leaving the province in a vibrant, emerald hue that no camera could truly capture. Arthur stood by the car, now successfully pulled from the mud, looking at the humble hut that had sheltered him. He looked at his hands, which were stained with the same earth as the men who had helped him, and he realized he didn't want to wash it off just yet. He didn't see the factory as a cost center anymore. He saw it as the lifeblood of community that defined the word Pakikisama, the art of living in harmony. He realized that if he closed those doors, he wasn't just optimizing assets. He was tearing a hole in a fabric of kindness he didn't even know existed. The inefficiency he had mocked was actually the grace of people who prioritized a neighbor's soul over machine's output. He gathered the workers at the factory later that morning, but the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. Instead of reading from his prepared script of layoffs and cutbacks, he spoke from the heart. He told them about the night in the storm, about Lola's porridge, and about the man who refused his money. He announced that the factory would stay open, but more than that, it would become a center for community development. He realized his Utang and Loob, his debt of gratitude, to this land was something he could never fully repay with a paycheck, but he would spend the rest of his career trying. He had come to the Philippines to teach them how to work, but they had taught him how to live. As Arthur sat in the departure lounge of the airport, he was no longer the man in the iron suit clutching a briefcase. He wore a simple bearing Tagalog, a gift from the factory workers, and he carried a small bag of dried mangoes Lola had pressed into his hands before he left. He looked at his reflection in the glass and saw a stranger, a man whose face was relaxed, whose heart was full and whose definition of wealth had been completely rewritten. He realized that the greatest tragedy of his life wasn't the money he had lost, but the years he had spent being rich while his spirit was bankrupt. He boarded the plane not as a conqueror returning from a successful mission, but as a student who had finally passed the only test that mattered. He knew that London would feel different now. The cold glass towers would no longer satisfy him. He had found a second home in the warmth of the Filipino spirit, a place where he was loved not for his title, but for his humanity. As the plane soared over the turquoise waters of the archipelago, Arthur whispered a silent thank you to the islands. He had come to fire 1,000 people, but instead he had found the one person he had lost long ago, himself. The story of Arthur reminds us that the most expensive things in life, our time, our pride, and our status, are often the very things that prevent us from being truly wealthy. In the eyes of the world, he was a king, but it took a storm and a humble bowl of porridge to show him he was a pauper in spirit. The Philippines does not just offer beautiful sunsets and white sand. It offers a mirror to the soul, reflecting back a reminder that we are all connected by the invisible threads of Malacquit. True success isn't found in how many people work for you, but in how many people you are willing to stand in the rain for. May we all find the courage to let our walls crumble and allow the kindness of others to build us back up. Have you ever experienced a moment of unexpected kindness from a stranger that changed the way you see the world? Tell us your story in the comments below.